I've never seen anyone cry like that at the doorstep of a millionaire's mansion before. The tears weren't just from desperation, they were the raw cry of someone carrying the weight of a whole family on her fragile shoulders. Her voice cracked like broken glass when she whispered those words that would change everything. I don't know where you're listening from. Maybe you're cleaning a kitchen, folding clothes, or heading home after a long day. It doesn't matter what time it is, but I promise, today's story will surprise you. The morning mist hung over Biscayne Bay like a silk veil, and in the distance, the towering glass monuments of downtown Miami caught the first golden rays of sunlight. But here, in the exclusive enclave of Star Island, where the ultra-wealthy lived behind fortress-like gates, the air itself seemed to carry the weight of money and silence. The mansion of Simon Caldwell rose from manicured lawns like a marble temple to success, $60 million of cold perfection with infinity pools that mirrored an empty sky and windows that reflected nothing but loneliness. Inside, the silence was deafening. Simon Caldwell, at 58, was one of South Florida's most successful hedge fund managers, his portfolio worth over $3 billion in assets, his investments spanning from cryptocurrency ventures to prime real estate across 3 continents. Yet he moved through his 20,000-square-foot home like a ghost, his footsteps echoing against Italian marble floors that had never known the warmth of genuine laughter. 5 years had passed since his wife Elena's death from cancer, and in those 5 years, his children had become strangers, his fortune had multiplied, and his heart had turned to stone. The kitchen, with its restaurant-grade appliances and granite countertops that cost more than most people's annual income, remained mostly unused. Simon survived on takeout from expensive restaurants and the occasional meal prepared by his rotating staff of housekeepers, women who came and went like shadows, dismissed for the smallest infractions or simply because their presence reminded him that his life had become a hollow shell. His daughter Rebecca, 26, lived in New York pursuing an art career funded by his trust funds, calling only when she needed more money transferred to her account. His son Marcus, 23, drifted between Miami Beach nightclubs and his father's various investment properties, numbing himself with parties and substances that Simon's wealth could always make disappear from police records. The household staff whispered among themselves about the curse that seemed to follow anyone who worked in the Caldwell mansion. Maids were fired for breathing too loudly, cooks dismissed for seasoning food with too much salt, gardeners sent away for allowing a single leaf to fall on the pristine driveway. Mrs. Henderson, the stern housekeeper who had been Elena's closest confidant, had quit the month after the funeral, unable to bear watching Simon transform from a loving husband and father into a bitter recluse who measured human worth in profit margins and investment returns. It was on a humid Tuesday morning in September, when the Miami heat pressed down like a suffocating blanket, that Rosa Martinez first walked through those imposing iron gates. At 47 years old, Rosa carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who had learned that survival meant holding your head high even when the world insisted on looking down at you. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her hands, those hands that told the story of 25 years of domestic work, were steady as she clutched the small purse that contained her entire savings, $317.43. Rosa's journey to the Caldwell mansion had begun in the pre-dawn darkness of her small apartment in Little Havana, where the sounds of her neighborhood waking up, the distant call of the bread vendor, the rumble of city buses, the morning news in rapid Spanish from her neighbor's radio, had become the soundtrack of her life. She had taken 2 buses and walked 8 blocks in heels that pinched her feet because she knew that first impressions mattered, especially when you were asking for a chance from people who could afford to be selective. The advertisement in the Miami Herald had been brief. Experienced housekeeper needed for private estate, discretion essential, competitive salary. But Rosa knew that competitive salary for domestic work in Miami still meant she would need to work 7 days a week to pay her mother's medical bills, her own rent, and have something left over to send to her sister Carmen in Honduras, whose husband had been injured in a construction accident and could no longer work. When the massive front door opened, Rosa found herself face to face with James, the butler, whose crisp British accent and cold gray eyes immediately made her feel like an intruder. He was a man in his 60s who had spent 30 years working for wealthy families, and he had perfected the art of making service staff feel invisible while simultaneously watching their every move for signs of inadequacy. "Mrs. Martinez, I presume," James said, his voice carrying the kind of formality that felt like a wall. "Mr. Caldwell will see you briefly. Please understand that he has very specific expectations for household staff. The previous housekeeper was dismissed for overstepping boundaries. I trust you understand the importance of maintaining professional distance." Rosa nodded, her fingers tightening around her purse strap. She had cleaned houses for over 2 decades, had worked for doctors, lawyers, small business owners, and even a retired baseball player who lived in Coral Gables. But this felt different. The sheer scale of wealth on display was overwhelming. Crystal chandeliers that probably cost more than her annual salary, artwork that looked like it belonged in museums, furniture that seemed designed more for display than comfort. Simon appeared at the top of a sweeping staircase that curved like something from a Hollywood movie set. He descended slowly, his Italian leather shoes clicking against marble steps, his presence filling the vast foyer with an energy that was both commanding and deeply sad. He was still a handsome man, with silver threading through his dark hair and eyes that had once been kind, but now held the wariness of someone who had been hurt too often. His navy suit was perfectly tailored, probably costing more than Rosa made in 3 months, yet it hung on him like armor rather than clothing. "Mrs. Martinez," he said, his voice neutral but not unkind, "James tells me you have extensive experience in household management. My requirements are simple but non-negotiable. This house operates on precision. Meals are prepared according to specific dietary guidelines. No salt, minimal carbohydrates, nothing that might remind me of." He paused, a shadow crossing his face. "Nothing too familiar. The staff quarters are separate from the main house. Personal conversation is discouraged. Your wages will be deposited directly into your account bi-weekly. Do you have any questions?" Rosa met his gaze directly, something that seemed to surprise him. "Mr. Caldwell, I understand your need for privacy and efficiency. I've worked for busy professionals before. My question is simple. What happened to the last housekeeper?" Simon's eyebrows raised slightly. Most domestic workers, intimidated by his wealth and reputation, simply nodded and accepted whatever terms he offered. "She became too familiar with family business. She offered unsolicited advice about my children, expressed opinions about household matters that were not her concern. I expect my staff to clean, cook, and maintain the property without becoming emotionally invested in our personal affairs." There was something in the way he said, "emotionally invested," that made Rosa's heart ache. She recognized the tone of someone who had built walls so high that even kindness felt threatening. "I understand, sir. I'm here to work, to do good work. My mother always taught me that the way you care for someone's home reflects who you are as a person." "Your mother," Simon repeated, and for a moment his expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Yes, well, when can you start?" The first weeks at the Caldwell mansion were like walking through an emotional minefield. Rosa quickly learned the rhythms of a house that functioned more like an expensive hotel than a home. Simon left for his downtown office before sunrise and rarely returned before 8 in the evening. When he was home, he moved through the rooms like a specter, reviewing financial reports on his tablet, taking calls about investment opportunities, or sitting alone in his study surrounded by monitors displaying real-time market data and cryptocurrency fluctuations. The isolation was suffocating. Rosa found herself polishing furniture that never got dusty, organizing closets that were already perfectly arranged, preparing meals that were often left untouched because Simon would cancel dinner plans to attend business meetings or simply forget to eat altogether. The mansion's smart home system controlled everything from lighting to temperature, all programmed to operate with mechanical efficiency that left no room for the small imperfections that made a space feel alive. James supervised Rose's work with the intensity of a military inspector, noting if a pillow was askew or if she spent too much time in any particular room. The other staff members, a gardener who came twice a week, a pool cleaner, a woman who handled Simon's personal laundry, worked in isolation, communicating only when necessary and leaving as quickly as possible when their tasks were complete. But Rosa noticed things that others missed or chose to ignore. She saw how Simon's hands trembled slightly when he thought no one was looking, how he sometimes stood in the doorway of what had clearly been his wife's office, now converted to a sterile guest room. She observed that he kept his wedding ring in a small dish on his nightstand, taking it out sometimes in the evening when he thought the house was empty. She noticed the prescription bottles hidden behind books in his study, medications for anxiety, for insomnia, for the kind of depression that money couldn't cure. The house itself seemed to whisper stories of better times. Family photos had been removed, but Rosa could see the faint outlines on the walls where they had hung. Elena's presence lingered in small details, a garden that was now maintained but no longer loved, a piano in the living room that collected dust, a kitchen designed for someone who had enjoyed cooking but now felt like a museum display. Rosa's own story was written in the calluses on her palms and the tiredness that settled into her bones each evening. Every morning, she woke at 4:30 in the staff quarters, a small but comfortable apartment above the garage that was larger than anywhere she had ever lived. She would prepare Simon's breakfast, though he rarely ate more than black coffee and perhaps a piece of wheat toast. She would clean rooms that were already pristine, dust furniture that sparkled, and maintain the kind of perfection that felt more like punishment than pride. Her phone calls home to Little Havana became her lifeline. Her mother, Maria, was battling diabetes and heart disease, conditions that required expensive medications and regular doctor visits that strained Rosa's budget even with her improved salary from the Caldwell job. Her sister Carmen called from Honduras with updates about her husband's recovery and their 3 children who were counting on Rosa's financial support to stay in school. "Mija," her mother would say during their evening conversations. "You sound tired. Are they treating you well?" Rosa would look around the spotless kitchen, at the granite countertops that reflected her own exhaustion, and find ways to answer truthfully without worrying her mother. "It's a big job, Mommy, but it's good work. The pay is helping with your medications." What she didn't tell her mother was how the silence in the mansion sometimes felt like drowning. How she had started humming old songs just to hear something human in the vast spaces. How she worried about a man who had so much money that his investment portfolio fluctuated by millions of dollars daily, but who seemed to have forgotten how to simply live. Then came the afternoon that changed everything. Rosa was in the kitchen, preparing what had become Simon's standard dinner, grilled chicken breast with steamed vegetables, no seasoning that might trigger memories or emotions. The kitchen windows faced west, and the Miami sunset was painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reminded her of the sunsets she used to watch with her children when they were small, back when wonder was still possible. Almost without thinking, Rosa began preparing a different meal. Her hands moved with muscle memory as she seasoned chicken with cumin and garlic, set rice to cook with just a touch of saffron, and prepared black beans the way her grandmother had taught her 40 years ago in a much smaller kitchen in a much smaller world. She hummed softly as she worked, an old bolero that her father used to sing while he shaved in the mornings, a song about love that endures beyond memory. The aroma filled the kitchen and drifted into the hallway, carrying with it the essence of home, of family, of meals prepared with love rather than obligation. Rosa didn't realize she had an audience until she turned to see Simon standing in the doorway, his business suit replaced with casual clothes, his usually guarded expression showing something she hadn't seen before, confusion mixed with what looked almost like hunger. Not for food, but for something he couldn't name. "Mrs. Martinez," he said quietly, "that smells like home," Rosa finished gently, not stopping her work but glancing at him with eyes that held no judgment, only understanding. Simon stepped into the kitchen, something he rarely did, his movements uncertain as if he were entering foreign territory. My wife used to cook. I mean, we had help, but Elena loved to cook on weekends. She would insist on preparing Sunday dinners herself, said that food tastes different when it's made with intention rather than duty. It was the first time Rosa had heard him mention his wife by name, the first crack in the armor he wore so carefully. She continued working, giving him space to speak or remain silent, both options equally acceptable. She had this theory, Simon continued, that you could taste love in food. I used to think it was romantic nonsense, something she said because she enjoyed the idea more than the reality. But now? He paused, watching Rosa's hands as she stirred the beans, and Rosa could see him struggling with emotions that his wealth couldn't organize or control. I haven't tasted anything in 5 years. Everything is just fuel. Rosa looked at him then, really looked at him, seeing not the billionaire whose name appeared in Forbes magazine, but a man whose grief had isolated him so completely that he had forgotten how to experience simple pleasures. "Mr. Caldwell, may I ask you something?" He nodded, seeming almost relieved to have a conversation that went beyond household schedules and staff requirements. "When was the last time you sat at your dining table for an entire meal? Not checking your phone, not reviewing reports, just eating?" Simon was quiet for so long that Rosa thought he might not answer. Finally he said, "I can't remember. Probably not since Elena died. We used to have dinner together every night when we were home. She insisted on it, said that families who eat together stay connected. After she was gone, sitting at that table felt like—" He struggled for words. "Like missing her twice," Rosa said softly. "Once because she wasn't there, and again because the ritual reminded you of what you'd lost." Simon stared at her, his expression shifting to something between surprise and recognition. "Yes, exactly that. How did you know?" Rosa smiled, a sad but understanding smile. "Because I lost my husband 8 years ago, and for 2 years, I couldn't make his favorite meal, pollo guisado, because every time I smelled it cooking, I would remember him coming home from work, tired but happy because he knew I was making something special just for him. It felt easier to eat simple things, things that didn't carry memories." "What changed?" Simon asked. "My daughter asked me to teach her the recipe. She said she wanted to remember her father not just in sadness, but in celebration. So we cooked together, and we cried, and we laughed, and we remembered him with joy instead of just pain. The food still carried love, but it carried healing too." Simon was quiet for a long moment, watching Rosa plate the meal she had prepared. The kitchen felt warmer somehow, filled with the aroma of spices and the presence of 2 people who had found common ground in loss. "Mrs. Martinez, Rosa, would you join me for dinner tonight? I know it's not professional protocol, but I think I'm tired of eating alone with my grief." Rosa studied his face, seeing the vulnerability behind the request. This was a man who could buy and sell restaurants, who had dined with presidents and celebrities, asking a housekeeper to share a simple meal because he had forgotten how to be human with another person. "Yes," she said simply. "I would be honored." That evening marked the beginning of a transformation so gradual that neither Rosa nor Simon fully recognized it at first. They sat at the massive dining table that had been designed to seat 16 but felt intimate with just the 2 of them at one end. Simon's phone remained face down and silent. A small but significant victory over habits that had ruled his life for 5 years. As they ate, Rosa shared stories about her family. Her mother's stubborn independence despite her illness, her sister's children who sent drawings and school reports from Honduras, her nephew who dreamed of becoming an engineer. Simon found himself talking about Elena, not with the careful, measured tones he used in therapy or business meetings, but with the natural cadence of someone remembering a person he had loved deeply. "She would have liked you," he said suddenly, surprised by his own words. "How do you know?" Rosa asked, because she believed that the people who care for others really care, not just professionally but personally, have a kind of wisdom that can't be taught or purchased. She would have recognized that in you immediately. Over the following weeks, small changes rippled through the mansion like stones dropped into still water. Simon began coming home earlier, not rushing to his study, but lingering in common spaces where he might encounter Rosa's quiet presence. She continued her work with the same diligence, but the house began to feel less like a mausoleum and more like a place where people actually lived. Rosa noticed that Simon had started leaving his wedding ring on his finger instead of hiding it in his nightstand. She observed that he had moved some of Elena's books back to the living room shelves, not as shrines, but as natural parts of the home's landscape. The prescription bottles in his study didn't disappear, but they were no longer hidden. And she noticed that some of them remained unopened for longer periods. The real breakthrough came on a rainy Thursday evening in October. Rosa was in Elena's former office, which Simon had asked her to convert back to its original purpose, when she discovered a box of photographs that had been stored in the closet. Unable to resist, she found herself looking through images of the family Simon had been before grief redefined him, pictures of birthday parties and vacations, Christmas mornings and casual Sunday afternoons. In every photo, Elena's presence was like sunlight, warm and natural, and completely unself-conscious. "Those were taken during better times," Simon's voice came from behind her. Rosa turned, expecting to see anger or hurt, but instead found Simon's expression soft with memory rather than pain. "She was beautiful," Rosa said simply. "And you looked happy. Really, genuinely happy?" "We were," Simon replied, sitting in the chair beside Rosa and taking some of the photographs. "I've been so afraid of forgetting her that I stopped remembering her." Does that make sense? Perfect sense. Sometimes love becomes so precious that we try to preserve it by locking it away. But love isn't meant to be preserved. It's meant to be lived. Simon looked at Rosa with an expression of profound gratitude. "You know, my children haven't been home in months. Rebecca calls when she needs money for her art studio, and Marcus texts when he wants access to one of the vacation properties. They think I've become some kind of monster." "Have you asked them to come home?" The question seemed to surprise him. What would I say? "Come visit your father who stopped being a father when your mother died?" Rosa smiled gently. "You could start with, 'I miss you,' and see where the conversation goes from there." That evening, Simon made 2 phone calls. The first was to Rebecca in New York, a conversation that began awkwardly, but ended with her promise to visit Miami the following weekend. The second was to Marcus, who was surprised to hear from his father about something other than bank transfers or legal issues stemming from his party lifestyle. The weekend visit from Rebecca revealed just how much the family had fractured since Elena's death. Rebecca arrived carrying the defensive posture of someone expecting conflict, her artist's eye immediately noting the changes in the house, the return of warmth to spaces that had felt frozen, the subtle but unmistakable signs that someone was caring for her father in ways that went beyond professional duty. "Dad, you seem different," Rebecca said over the dinner that Rosa had prepared, a menu that balanced simple elegance with the kind of comfort food that invited actual conversation. "Different how?" Simon asked. "Present, like you're actually here instead of just occupying space." Marcus, who had arrived late and slightly intoxicated, was less diplomatic. "So the maid is fixing our broken family now? That's rich, Dad, literally." The comment hung in the air like a slap, and Rosa felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. She started to stand, to excuse herself from what was clearly a family matter, but Simon's voice stopped her. "Marcus, Rosa's name is Rosa Martinez, and she's been working to rebuild what I spent 5 years tearing down. If you can't speak to her with respect, you can leave." It was the first time Rosa had heard Simon defend anyone's dignity, including his own, in months. The moment felt significant, a line drawn not just about treatment of staff, but about the kind of person Simon was choosing to become. The evening continued with tension, but also with honest conversation that the family hadn't had since Elena's funeral. Rebecca talked about her art, her struggles to establish herself in New York's competitive gallery scene, her loneliness in a city that demanded constant performance. Marcus, sobered by his father's unexpected firmness, admitted that his party lifestyle was less about fun and more about numbing the guilt he felt over not being home when his mother was dying. "I was in Ibiza with friends when she had her last seizure," Marcus confessed. "I knew she was sick, but I thought we had more time. I thought I could come home later when I was ready to deal with death. By the time I got back, she was already gone, and you were already gone too, Dad. Not dead, but not really alive either." Simon looked at his son with eyes full of regret and understanding. "I'm sorry, Marcus. I was so lost in my own grief that I forgot you were grieving too. Your mother's death didn't just take her from me. It took me from you and Rebecca when you needed me most." Rosa watched this family begin the delicate process of finding each other again, and she felt both honored to witness it and aware that her role was shifting. She was no longer just a housekeeper maintaining an empty mansion. She had become a catalyst for healing that was bigger than any of them had expected. But healing is rarely a straight line, and the forces of old habits and external pressures were building toward a crisis that would test everything that had been rebuilt. The crisis arrived on a Monday morning in November, delivered by James with the clinical precision he brought to all household crises. Rosa was preparing breakfast when the butler appeared in the kitchen doorway, his expression even more severe than usual. "Mrs. Martinez, we need to discuss a serious matter. Mr. Caldwell's Rolex Submariner is missing from his study. It was there Friday evening, and now it's gone. You were the only staff member with access to his study over the weekend." Rosa's hand stilled on the countertop, her heart beginning to race not from guilt, but from the familiar feeling of being assumed guilty because of her position, her background, her expendability in the eyes of people who had the luxury of suspicion. "Mr. James, I didn't take anything from Mr. Caldwell's study or anywhere else in this house. The watch is worth $45,000. It's a special edition that Mr. Caldwell received as a gift from his late wife. I'm sure you understand the gravity of this situation." The kitchen felt like it was shrinking around Rosa. She had faced accusations before, in other houses, from other employers who found it easier to blame the domestic staff than to consider other explanations for missing items. But this felt different, more devastating, because she had begun to believe that Simon saw her as more than just another easily replaceable employee. "Where is Mr. Caldwell?" Rosa asked quietly. "He's on a conference call with investors in Tokyo. But Mrs. Martinez, this matter needs to be resolved immediately. I'm going to have to ask you to gather your belongings while I contact the security company about reviewing the camera footage from the weekend." Rosa nodded slowly, her dignity intact but her heart breaking. She had survived worse humiliations, had endured false accusations and unfair dismissals, but somehow this felt like losing something precious that she hadn't even realized she had gained. The sense of belonging somewhere, of being valued for more than just her ability to clean and organize and disappear when convenient. She packed her few belongings in the small suitcase she had brought 3 months earlier, her movements careful and deliberate. As she folded her uniforms, she thought about her mother's medical bills, about her sister's family in Honduras, about the financial stability that this job had provided. But more than that, she thought about Simon eating alone again, about the photographs that would probably be returned to their hiding places, about a man who had been learning to live again, potentially retreating back into the fortress of his grief. When she emerged from the staff quarters carrying her suitcase, she found Simon standing beside his car in the circular driveway, his phone pressed to his ear as he spoke in the rapid, clipped tones of high-stakes business. He glanced at her, and Rosa saw confusion cross his face as he registered her suitcase and the finality in her posture. He ended his call abruptly. "Rosa, what's happening? Why do you have your things?" Before Rosa could answer, James appeared, his timing impeccable and his intention clear. Mr. Caldwell, I informed Mrs. Martinez about the missing watch. Given the circumstances, I felt it was appropriate to terminate her employment immediately pending investigation. Simon's expression shifted through several emotions: confusion, disbelief, and then something that looked almost like betrayal, though Rosa couldn't tell if it was directed at her or at the situation itself. "The watch from Elena," Simon said slowly, his voice careful and controlled. "You're saying Rosa took Elena's watch?" "I'm not saying she took anything," Rosa replied quietly, meeting his eyes directly. "I'm saying that I understand how things look, and I understand that sometimes it's easier to blame people like me when things go missing in houses like this. I've worked in enough homes to know how these situations usually resolve." Something in her calm acceptance of injustice seemed to wound Simon more than anger or denials might have. He stared at her for a long moment, and Rosa could see him struggling with competing loyalties: his trust in James, who had worked for the family for years, and his growing belief in Rosa's character. "James, give us a moment," Simon said finally. When they were alone, Simon stepped closer to Rosa, his voice low and urgent. "Did you take the watch?" Rosa looked at him steadily. "No, Mr. Caldwell, I did not. But I also understand that you have to consider all possibilities, and I understand that my denial doesn't carry the same weight as James's suspicions. I've been accused of theft before, by families I worked for faithfully for years. It's part of being someone like me in places like this." "Someone like you." Simon's voice carried an edge of something, anger perhaps, but not directed at her. "Someone whose word doesn't matter as much as someone else's assumptions, someone who can be replaced more easily than believed." Simon was quiet for a long moment, his business mind clearly working through the implications and possibilities. But Rosa could see something else in his expression, a recognition of the position she was in, the impossible dynamics at play. "Rosa, I need you to know that these past months you've helped me remember who I used to be. If you say you didn't take the watch, I believe you." The simple statement hit Rosa harder than the accusation had. When was the last time anyone had simply believed her word without requiring proof, investigation, or corroboration? "Thank you," she said softly. "But Mr. Caldwell, I think it's better for everyone if I go. Even if the watch is found, even if this is resolved, there will always be doubt. And you need staff you can trust completely, not people you have to defend." She turned to walk toward the gates, her spine straight and her dignity intact, leaving behind not just a job but the closest thing to family she had felt in years. Behind her, Simon watched her go, his heart telling him one thing, while his practical mind wrestled with doubt and the weight of other people's certainties. The mansion felt immediately hollow without Rosa's presence. Simon found himself walking through rooms that looked exactly the same, but felt fundamentally changed, as if someone had drained all the warmth from the air. Meals became mechanical again, prepared by a temporary agency worker who cooked efficiently but without any trace of the love Rosa had brought to simple tasks. James continued his duties with professional satisfaction, pleased that order had been restored and potential scandal averted. But Simon noticed things that bothered him. The way James seemed almost relieved that Rosa was gone, the speed with which he had moved to accusation rather than investigation, the assumption of guilt that had driven the entire crisis. It was Rebecca, calling from New York 3 days later, who asked the question that had been nagging at Simon's consciousness. "Dad, have you actually looked for the watch? Like, really looked, not just assumed it was stolen?" The question sent Simon to his study with new purpose. He searched methodically through drawers, behind books, in places he might have absent-mindedly set the watch and forgotten. The Rolex had been Elena's final gift to him, purchased during her last good week, and presented with the kind of ceremony she brought to all meaningful moments. It was indeed worth $45,000, but its sentimental value was incalculable. He found it on Thursday evening, slipped between the cushions of the leather chair where he often sat during late-night phone calls with Asian markets. It had obviously fallen from his wrist while he was working, sliding into the gap where it was invisible unless someone was specifically searching. Simon stood in his study holding the watch, feeling the weight of both relief and shame. Rosa had been telling the truth, had maintained her dignity through false accusation, had walked away rather than fight a system that was designed to distrust people like her. The realization of what he had allowed to happen or failed to prevent sat on his chest like a stone. James's reaction to the discovery was telling in its defensiveness. "Well, of course we're all relieved that the watch has been found, but you must understand, Mr. Caldwell, that in situations like these, we have to consider all possibilities. It was a reasonable precaution." Was it reasonable to assume guilt instead of investigating other possibilities first? Simon asked quietly. "Sir, with respect, domestic staff have access to valuable items. And statistically, Simon interrupted, Rosa Martinez worked in this house for 3 months, preparing my meals, organizing my personal belongings, handling my most private spaces, and never once gave me reason to question her integrity. Statistically, James, you jump to conclusions based on prejudice, not evidence." The conversation marked a turning point in Simon's understanding of the power dynamics that had always existed in his household, but which he had never examined closely. As someone who had built his fortune on careful analysis of risk and evidence, he was forced to confront the reality that he had allowed assumptions and biases to drive decisions about someone who had become important to him. Finding Rosa again required more effort than Simon had anticipated. She'd given her address as Little Havana, but the specific apartment building and unit number were filed away in household records that James controlled. When Simon demanded the information, he discovered that James had been less than thorough in maintaining employee records, apparently seeing little need to document the personal details of temporary staff. It took 2 days of searching, driving through neighborhoods that were as foreign to Simon as distant countries, despite being only 20 minutes from his mansion. His sleek Mercedes felt alien on streets where people walked to work, where children played soccer in small parks, where the rhythms of life moved to music he had never learned to hear. He finally found her building on a Saturday afternoon, a modest 3-story complex painted in faded pink, with laundry hanging from balconies and the sounds of family life drifting through open windows. Simon sat in his car for 20 minutes, practicing what he would say, trying to find words that would bridge the gap between his world and hers, between his mistake and her dignity. Rosa answered her door wearing jeans and a faded t-shirt, her hair loose around her shoulders in a way that made her look younger and somehow more herself than she had ever looked in his house. The surprise in her eyes when she saw him quickly gave way to something more guarded. "Mr. Caldwell, is everything all right?" "Rosa, I found the watch. It was in my study, fallen between cushions. You were right and I was wrong, and I need to apologize." She studied his face, and Simon realized she was assessing not just his words but his intentions, trying to determine if this was genuine contrition or simply the guilt of someone who wanted to feel better about his choices. "Would you like to come in?" she asked finally. Rosa's apartment was small, but filled with the kind of warmth that his mansion, for all its size and luxury, had never achieved. Family photos covered every available surface. Children at school graduations, holiday celebrations, 3 generations of women who shared Rosa's kind eyes and quiet strength. The furniture was simple but well cared for, and the air carried the scent of coffee and the faint perfume of flowers that Rosa grew in pots on her small balcony. "This is beautiful," Simon said, and meant it. "Thank you. It's not much, but it's home. Can I offer you coffee?" As Rosa moved around her small kitchen, Simon found himself seeing her in a completely different context. In his house, she had always been the employee, gracious and professional, but ultimately defined by her function. Here, she was simply herself, a woman who had built a life of dignity and purpose despite financial constraints that would have defeated many people. "Rosa, I need to tell you something beyond just the apology about the watch. These past days without you, I realized that you weren't just helping me maintain my house. You were helping me remember how to live in it, how to be human in it. Rosa set 2 cups of coffee on her small dining table, the gesture simple but somehow ceremonial. Mr. Caldwell, Simon, I accepted that job because I needed the money. My mother's medical bills, my family's needs, they're real and urgent. But somewhere along the way, I started caring about you, about your healing. And when James accused me of theft, it hurt not just because it was unfair, but because it felt like losing family all over again. Simon felt the weight of her words, the generosity of spirit that had allowed her to care about his well-being, even while working in a system that devalued her dignity. I fired James this morning, Simon said quietly, not just because of the watch incident, but because I realized he represented a way of thinking about people that I don't want in my life anymore. Rosa, I'd like you to come back, not as a housekeeper, but as, I'm not sure what the title would be. Someone who helps me remember how to live. Someone who's part of the family rather than just employed by it. Rosa was quiet for a long time, her dark eyes thoughtful as she considered his offer. Simon, what you're describing sounds wonderful, but I need you to understand something. I can't come back just to be the magical person who fixes your sadness. I have my own life, my own struggles, my own dreams that have nothing to do with your healing. If I return, it has to be as an equal, not as someone whose job it is to make you feel better about yourself. Her honesty was like fresh air in a room that had been closed for too long. Simon realized that throughout their relationship, he had been seeing Rosa primarily in terms of what she could do for him, how she could help him heal, rather than as a complete person with her own needs and aspirations. You're absolutely right. I've been selfish, even in appreciating you. Tell me about your dreams, Rosa. What do you want for yourself, beyond just surviving? Rosa smiled. The first genuinely relaxed smile he had seen from her since the morning of the accusation. I want to open a small restaurant someday. Nothing fancy, just a place where people can taste home in every bite. I want to bring my sister and her children here from Honduras, legally, so they can have opportunities for education and safety. And I want my mother to live long enough to see her great-grandchildren grow up happy in a country that offers them hope. Those are beautiful dreams, Simon said, and they're achievable. If you're willing to come back, I'd like to help make them happen, not as charity, but as partnership. You've helped me remember how to be human. Let me help you build the life you're dreaming of. Rosa studied his face, seeing something different from the broken man she had first met months ago. This Simon had been tempered by loss, but not destroyed by it, had learned to recognize his own limitations and biases, had grown into someone capable of seeing other people as complete individuals rather than functions in his life. All right, she said finally, but we're going to do this differently this time. I'll come back to help run your household, but I also want to start planning for my restaurant. And I want you to meet my family, really meet them, not as your employees' relatives, but as people who are important to me. Simon nodded, feeling something like excitement for the first time in years. I'd be honored to meet your family. And Rosa, thank you for giving me another chance to get this right. The return to the mansion felt like a homecoming for both of them, but it was different this time. Simon had hired a new household manager, a woman in her 50s who had worked for other wealthy families and understood that staff deserved respect and professional treatment. Rosa's role evolved into something that had no exact job description, but encompassed elements of household management, family liaison, and trusted advisor. The changes were visible immediately. Simon's children began visiting more frequently, drawn by the warmth that had returned to their family home. Rebecca brought her artwork to show Rosa, seeking opinions from someone who looked at creativity with appreciation rather than judgment about its commercial viability. Marcus started staying sober during family visits, recognizing that the house had become a place for genuine connection rather than performance or conflict. Simon threw himself into supporting Rosa's dreams with the same intensity he had once applied to building his investment portfolio. He provided startup capital for her restaurant, connected her with immigration lawyers to help bring her sister's family to Miami legally, and ensured that her mother had access to the best possible medical care. But he was careful to structure these contributions as business partnerships and family support rather than charity, preserving Rosa's dignity and independence. The restaurant, when it opened 8 months later, was everything Rosa had dreamed of and more. Corazon occupied a small space in Coral Gables, with 15 tables, an open kitchen where diners could watch Rosa and her small staff prepare meals that tasted like love made tangible, and walls decorated with photographs of the extended family that had grown to include Simon and his children. On opening night, Simon sat at a corner table with Rebecca and Marcus, watching Rosa move through her dining room with the grace of someone who had found her true calling. The restaurant was full of neighbors, friends, and family members who had supported Rosa's dream, creating the kind of community that money couldn't buy, but that genuine relationships made possible. "Dad," Rebecca said quietly, "do you realize that you're smiling? I mean really smiling, not just politely smiling for social situations." Simon looked at his daughter, then at his son, then at the woman who had taught him that healing comes not from avoiding pain, but from finding purpose in helping others flourish. "I'm learning," he said. "I'm learning that the best investment returns aren't always financial. Sometimes they're measured in laughter, in family dinners that last for hours, in watching people you care about achieve their dreams." Marcus raised his glass of mineral water. He had been sober for 4 months, supported by his family and by Rosa's quiet but unwavering belief in his capacity for change. "To second chances," he said, "to people who see who we could be instead of just who we've been." The toast encompassed more than just the 4 of them at that table. It honored Rosa's mother, who had traveled from Little Havana to see her daughter's restaurant, and who spent the evening telling anyone who would listen about her brilliant chef daughter. It included Rosa's sister Carmen, who had arrived from Honduras 2 weeks earlier with her 3 children, all of whom were now enrolled in Miami schools and living in a house that Simon had helped Rosa purchase in a neighborhood where dreams felt achievable. And in a way that none of them fully understood, but all of them felt, the toast included Elena, whose presence seemed to bless this gathering of people who had learned to love each other, not despite their differences, but because of them. A year later, Simon's life had been transformed in ways that no amount of money could have purchased. His relationship with his children had deepened into genuine friendship and mutual respect. His investment strategies had shifted to include companies that prioritized employee welfare and community development, earning him recognition as a socially responsible investor rather than just a profitable one. Rosa's restaurant had become a neighborhood institution, the kind of place where regulars were greeted by name and first-time diners were treated like family. Her sister Carmen had found work as a teacher's aide, using her bilingual skills to help other immigrant families navigate the American education system. Rosa's mother had celebrated her 70th birthday, surrounded by 3 generations of family, her health stabilized by excellent medical care, and the joy of watching her grandchildren thrive in their new country. The mansion on Star Island had become a gathering place for this extended family, its formal dining room converted to a space where business discussions and family celebrations flowed together naturally. Simon's study, once a refuge from human connection, had become Rosa's office on the days when she worked on restaurant business, the 2 of them collaborating on expansion plans and community outreach programs that used food as a bridge between different cultural communities in Miami. On a quiet Sunday evening in December, as Miami's version of winter brought slightly cooler temperatures and gentle breezes, Simon found Rosa on the mansion's patio, reviewing proposals for a second restaurant location. The space that had once felt like an expensive prison now hummed with the energy of purpose and connection. "You know," Simon said, settling into the chair beside her, "I spent years thinking that success meant accumulating enough wealth to insulate myself from disappointment. But I think I had it backwards." Rosa looked up from her papers, her expression encouraging him to continue. Real wealth is being vulnerable enough to let people matter to you. It's investing in relationships that can't be quantified on a balance sheet. It's understanding that the most valuable returns come from giving other people the resources to achieve their own dreams. Rosa smiled, the kind of smile that contained years of understanding and mutual respect. Elena would be proud of who you've become, not because you've gotten over losing her, but because you've learned to honor her memory by living the values she believed in. You think so? I know so. A woman who could love someone as deeply as Elena loved you would want her love to make you more capable of loving others, not less. As the Miami skyline lit up across the bay, Simon felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with financial portfolios or investment returns. His life had become rich in the ways that mattered most, rich with family, with purpose, with the knowledge that he was using his resources to create opportunities for others to flourish. Rosa gathered her papers, preparing to return to her apartment in Little Havana, where her family would be waiting with Sunday dinner and stories from the week. But she paused, looking at Simon with the expression of someone who had something important to say. Simon, I want you to know that what we've built together, this friendship, this extended family, this partnership, it's taught me something too. I spent so many years believing that my value came from how well I could take care of other people, how invisible I could make myself to avoid causing problems. But you've shown me that I deserve to take up space, to have opinions, to dream big dreams and pursue them. Rosa, you've always deserved those things. I was just too limited in my thinking to recognize it initially. Maybe. But sometimes we need other people to reflect back our worth until we can see it clearly ourselves. Thank you for seeing all of me, not just the parts that were useful to you. As Rosa drove home through the streets of Miami, past the coffee shops and family restaurants, past the small apartments where people were building lives of dignity and hope despite financial constraints, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. 2 years ago, she had been a woman carrying the weight of her family's survival on her shoulders, working in houses where her humanity was often invisible to the people she served. Now, she was a successful restaurant owner, a legal resident on the path to citizenship, a woman whose sister's children were thriving in American schools and whose mother's health was stable and well managed. But more than that, she was someone who had learned that her compassion and wisdom were not just survival tools, they were gifts that could transform other people's lives while honoring her own dignity. The restaurant industry is famously difficult, with most new establishments failing within their first year. But Corazon thrived because Rosa had learned to build businesses the same way she had learned to build relationships, with authenticity, consistency, and genuine care for everyone involved. Her staff felt valued and respected, her customers felt welcomed and nourished, and her community felt proud to support a business that reflected their own values and experiences. Simon's investment had been crucial, but it was Rosa's vision and integrity that had transformed financial resources into something meaningful and sustainable. She had proven that given genuine opportunity and respect, people who had been underestimated were capable of extraordinary achievement. As for Simon, the transformation had been perhaps even more dramatic. From a man who had isolated himself behind walls of grief and wealth, he had evolved into someone who understood that true security comes not from accumulating resources, but from building relationships strong enough to weather whatever storms life brings. His children had noticed the change and had begun modeling their own lives differently. Rebecca's art had taken on themes of connection and community, earning her recognition in galleries that valued social consciousness alongside aesthetic achievement. Marcus had channeled his charismatic personality into work with nonprofit organizations, using his family's resources and his own recovery experience to help other young people struggling with addiction find paths to sobriety and purpose. The Miami community had noticed as well. Simon's investment firm had become known for supporting businesses owned by women, immigrants and people of color, generating not only healthy financial returns, but also creating economic opportunities in communities that had historically been excluded from major capital investments. The Caldwell Foundation, established in Elena's memory, provided small business loans, educational scholarships, and healthcare assistance to working families throughout South Florida. But perhaps the most significant transformation was the most personal one. Simon had learned to measure success not in dollars accumulated, but in lives touched, not in properties acquired, but in relationships deepened, not in market dominance achieved, but in community contributions made. On a warm evening in May, exactly 2 years after Rosa had first walked through the gates of the Caldwell mansion, the extended family gathered to celebrate the second anniversary of Corazon's opening. The restaurant was closed to the public for a private party that included not only Rosa's family and Simon's children, but also the staff from both the restaurant and the mansion, longtime customers who had become friends, and community members whose lives had been touched by the various charitable initiatives that had grown from this unlikely partnership. Rosa stood before the group, her poise reflecting the confidence of someone who had grown into her own power while never losing her fundamental humility and grace. When I first started working as a housekeeper, I thought my job was to make myself invisible, to take care of other people's needs while never expecting my own to matter. I believed that was what it meant to be professional, to be grateful for work in a world that didn't always have space for people like me. The room was silent, everyone understanding that they were hearing something important and true. But I learned something from a very wise man, Rosa continued, glancing at Simon with affection, and from his equally wise children. I learned that taking care of others is most powerful when it comes from a place of self-respect rather than self-erasure. I learned that the best way to serve is from a position of strength, not subservience. She paused, looking around the room at faces that represented different backgrounds, different struggles, and different dreams, but who had all been brought together by the understanding that everyone's dignity mattered. Tonight, we're not just celebrating a restaurant or a business success. We're celebrating the idea that when people are given genuine respect and real opportunities, when their wisdom and experience are valued regardless of their job titles or bank account balances, everyone benefits. We all become richer, not just financially, but in all the ways that actually matter. Simon stood to respond, his voice carrying the conviction of someone who had learned important truths through experience rather than theory. 2 years ago, I was a man who had confused wealth with worth, who thought that success meant never needing anyone else. Rosa taught me that the opposite is true. Real success means building a life where you're needed and where you need others, where your resources create opportunities for everyone to flourish, where your security comes from the strength of your community rather than the height of your walls. He looked around the room, his gaze taking in Marcus, who was now 6 months sober and working full-time with non-profit organizations. Rebecca, whose art was being exhibited in venues that celebrated both aesthetic achievement and social consciousness. Carmen, who had been promoted to head teacher's aide at her school, and Rosa's mother, who was surrounded by great-grandchildren who spoke English and Spanish with equal fluency, and who saw unlimited possibilities in their futures. I thought I was hiring a housekeeper, Simon continued, but what I actually found was a teacher, a healer, and a friend who showed me that the best investments are the ones where everyone profits. The evening continued with music, with stories, with the kind of laughter that comes from people who genuinely enjoy each other's company. Children played between the tables while adults shared memories and made plans for the future. The boundaries between employer and employee, between rich and working class, between different cultural backgrounds, had dissolved into something more fundamental, the recognition of shared humanity and mutual respect. As the party wound down and families began to head home, Rosa found herself alone with Simon on the restaurant's small patio, looking out over the Miami skyline that had become the backdrop for their unlikely friendship. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't cried that first day at your door? Rosa asked. If I hadn't been desperate enough to show my vulnerability to a stranger? Simon considered the question thoughtfully. I think we both needed to be broken in just the right way to be open to healing each other. Your desperation made you willing to risk being human with someone who had forgotten how to be human. My loneliness made me finally ready to let someone else's wisdom matter more than my own pride. It's funny how life works sometimes. The things we think are our weaknesses turn out to be the very qualities that allow us to connect with others and build something meaningful. Elena used to say that our scars are proof that we're stronger than whatever tried to break us. But she also said that scars are most beautiful when they're part of a story that helps other people heal. Rosa nodded, understanding that this conversation encompassed not just their personal journey, but also the broader truth they had discovered together. That healing happens in relationship, that strength is often found in vulnerability, and that the most meaningful success comes from creating opportunities for others to thrive. 6 months later, Rosa received news that would test everything they had built together. Her mother's condition had worsened, and the doctors were clear that even with the best possible care, they were looking at months rather than years. The news came at a time when the restaurant business was at its most demanding, when Rosa was in negotiations to open a second location, when her sister's children were reaching crucial points in their education. Simon's response when Rosa shared the news revealed just how completely their relationship had evolved. Without hesitation, he restructured his own schedule to help manage the business aspects of the restaurant expansion, freeing Rosa to spend precious time with her mother. He arranged for the best possible hospice care, not as charity, but as family supporting family during a difficult time. But perhaps most importantly, he helped Rosa create a living memorial to her mother while she was still alive to appreciate it. Together, they established a scholarship program for children of domestic workers, providing educational opportunities for young people whose parents, like Rosa, had spent their lives taking care of other people's families while struggling to provide for their own. Rosa's mother lived to see the first scholarship recipients announced, young men and women whose dreams of college had seemed impossible until someone recognized that their parents' sacrificial work deserved to be honored and supported. She died peacefully at home, surrounded by 3 generations of family who were thriving in ways she had only dreamed possible when she first made the difficult decision to encourage Rosa to seek work in wealthy neighborhoods where her dignity would often be tested, but her opportunities for advancement might be greater. The funeral was held at a small church in Little Havana, but the congregation included people from across Miami's economic and cultural spectrum, restaurant customers who had become family friends, former domestic worker colleagues who had been inspired by Rosa's success to pursue their own dreams, community leaders who had partnered with the Caldwell Foundation on various initiatives, and of course, Simon and his children, who mourned properly as the family they had become. In the months following her mother's death, Rosa found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her from desperate tears at a mansion's doorstep to become a business owner, community leader, and cherished friend to people she had never imagined she would meet. The grief was real and profound, but it was grief held within a context of gratitude. Gratitude for the time they had been given, for the opportunities that had allowed her mother to see her grandchildren prosper, for the relationships that had transformed survival into purpose. Simon's support during this period demonstrated his growth from someone who had once retreated into isolation during times of loss to someone who understood that grief shared with people who love you is grief that can be survived and eventually transformed into meaningful action. And he didn't try to fix Rosa's sadness or hurry her through the mourning process, but he made sure she was never alone with the weight of loss and responsibility. The second Corazon location opened 9 months after Rosa's mother's death in a neighborhood that had been experiencing economic revitalization. This restaurant was larger than the original, with space for community events, cooking classes, and cultural celebrations that brought together Miami's diverse populations around the universal languages of food and hospitality. But Rosa also made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. She hired her first assistant manager, a young woman named Isabella who had grown up in foster care, had worked her way through community college while supporting herself with restaurant jobs, and whose combination of business acumen and genuine care for customers reminded Rosa of her younger self. "I want you to learn every aspect of this business," Rosa told Isabella during her first week. "Not because I plan to disappear, but because I want to create the same kind of opportunity for you that someone created for me. I want you to see that there's no limit to what you can achieve when someone believes in your potential and gives you real chances to grow." Isabella's eyes filled with tears, not tears of desperation like the ones Rosa had cried at Simon's door, but tears of recognition and possibility. "Ms. Martinez, no one has ever talked to me about my potential before. Everyone has always just seen me as someone who could work hard and follow directions." "Well," Rosa replied, "then it's time for people to start seeing more clearly." This conversation, repeated in various forms with other young staff members over the following months, became central to Rosa's understanding of her own success. She realized that her journey had never been just about her own advancement, but about proving that people from overlooked communities possessed intelligence, creativity, and leadership abilities that were often invisible to those in positions to provide opportunities. Simon watched Rosa develop into a mentor and community leader with the same pride he felt for his own children's achievements, but he also recognized that her success reflected his own growth as someone who had learned to see potential in places he had never thought to look before. Someone who measured his own worth not by what he could accumulate, but by what he could help others achieve. Their partnership expanded beyond the restaurant business to include real estate development projects that prioritized affordable housing and community spaces, immigration law initiatives that helped working families navigate complex legal systems, and educational programs that recognized the diverse forms of intelligence and experience that students brought to their learning. Each project reflected the central lesson they had learned together, that sustainable success comes from creating systems where everyone can thrive, where individual achievement is supported by community investment, where the barriers that divide people by economic class or cultural background are replaced by bridges built from mutual respect and shared opportunity. 5 years after Rosa had first walked through the gates of Simon's mansion, she stood before the Miami City Council as the recipient of the Community Leadership Award, an honor that recognized her contributions to economic development, immigrant rights, and social justice throughout South Florida. In her acceptance speech, she spoke about the domestic workers who had raised her, who had taught her that dignity comes not from the work you do but from how you do it, who had shown her that love and service are forms of strength rather than subservience. "My mother cleaned houses for 40 years, Rosa said to the packed auditorium. She scrubbed other people's floors and cooked other people's meals and raised other people's children while struggling to provide for her own family. She was never recognized with awards or featured in newspaper articles, but she was one of the most intelligent, capable, loving people I have ever known." The audience was silent, understanding that they were hearing something important about the invisible workers who made their own comfortable lives possible. "This award doesn't just honor me. It honors every domestic worker, every caregiver, every person who serves others with skill and compassion while dreaming of opportunities for themselves and their children. It recognizes that there is wisdom and leadership in communities that are often overlooked, potential in people who are often underestimated, strength in families who survive and thrive despite systems that are not designed to support them." She paused, looking out over the diverse crowd that included city officials, business leaders, community organizers, restaurant staff, family members, and Simon and his children, who had become living examples of how relationships across class and cultural lines could transform everyone involved. 5 years ago, I thought success meant finding a job that paid enough to cover my family's basic needs while asking for nothing more than the chance to work hard and remain invisible. I thought that was the most I could hope for as someone like me in a world like this. Rosa's voice carried the authority of someone who had learned important truths through experience rather than theory. But I learned that I was thinking too small. I learned that people like me, people who know what it means to struggle, who understand the value of every dollar and every opportunity, who have learned to be resourceful and resilient and compassionate. We don't just deserve jobs, we deserve partnerships, we deserve respect. We deserve the chance to build businesses and lead communities and make decisions that affect not just our own lives, but the lives of others. The standing ovation that followed was not just politeness, but genuine recognition of a truth that needed to be spoken and heard. Simon, watching from the audience, felt a sense of completion that was different from any business achievement he had ever experienced. Rosa's success had become inseparable from his own healing, but her growth had also transcended anything he could have imagined when he first reluctantly hired her to maintain his empty mansion. After the ceremony, as the extended family gathered for a celebration dinner at the original Corazon location, Simon found himself reflecting on the mysterious ways that life brings people together exactly when they need each other most. "You know," he said to Rosa during a quiet moment between toasts and congratulations, "I hired you because I needed someone to clean my house and prepare my meals. But what you actually did was teach me how to live again, how to love again, how to see my wealth as a tool for creating opportunities rather than just accumulating possessions." Rosa smiled, the kind of smile that contained years of shared experience and mutual affection. "And I took the job because I needed money to pay my mother's medical bills and keep my family afloat. But what I actually found was a chance to discover my own leadership abilities, to build a business that honors my community's values, and to create opportunities for other people who deserved better than what they had been offered." "It's almost like we were meant to find each other," Simon mused. "Or maybe," Rosa replied thoughtfully, "we were both ready to see possibilities that had always been there, but that we hadn't been prepared to recognize before. Maybe the magic wasn't in the meeting. Maybe it was in being open to letting the meeting change us." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Isabella, Rosa's assistant manager, who had news to share. She had been accepted to the University of Miami's business school, with tuition covered by a scholarship program that Simon had established for children and employees of service workers. "Ms. Martinez, Mr. Caldwell, I wanted you to be the first to know. I'm going to study hospitality management and business administration. My dream is to own my own restaurant someday, maybe even a small chain that employs people from my community and gives them the same kind of opportunities you've given me." Rosa embraced Isabella with tears in her eyes, seeing her younger self in this determined young woman who now understood that her dreams were not too big, her background was not too humble, and her potential was not limited by other people's expectations. Simon watched this interaction with deep satisfaction, understanding that this was how change really happened, not through grand gestures or charitable donations alone, but through individual relationships that expanded everyone's sense of what was possible, that created ripples of opportunity spreading outward into communities that had been waiting for someone to believe in their potential. The evening continued with music and laughter, with stories of struggle and triumph, with children playing between the tables, while adults planned for futures that seemed brighter and more achievable than they had ever dared to imagine. As the celebration wound down and families began to head home, Rosa stood in the doorway of her restaurant, looking out over the neighborhood that had become her community, surrounded by people who had become her chosen family, reflecting on a journey that had taken her from desperation to dignity, from survival to leadership, from invisibility to recognition. The young woman who had once cried at a millionaire's doorstep, begging for work that would help her save her mother's life, had become a successful business owner, a community leader, and a bridge between different worlds that too often remain separate and unknown to each other. But perhaps most importantly, She had learned that her own healing and success were inseparable from her ability to create space for other people to heal and succeed. That genuine security came not from accumulating resources for herself, but from building systems that allowed everyone in her community to thrive. And you? Have you ever worked for someone who learned from you without ever saying it? Maybe they were too proud to acknowledge it, but did their actions change? Did you see them become more human, more generous, more aware of the dignity that all work deserves when it's performed with skill and heart? Tell me your story in the comments. Share the moment when someone saw your worth even when you felt invisible, or the time when you realized that your wisdom and experience had value beyond just completing assigned tasks. If Rose's journey from desperate tears to quiet triumph touched something in your heart, if her transformation from invisible housekeeper to honored community leader reminded you of your own unrealized potential, leave a like and subscribe so this story can reach another woman who needs to hear that her dreams are not too big, her background is not too humble, and her potential is not limited by other people's assumptions. For more stories of dignity discovered, strength revealed, and lives transformed through the simple but revolutionary act of seeing each other as fully human, click the podcast link on the left. These are stories of real people whose quiet courage changes the world, one relationship at a time, one opportunity shared at a time, one moment of recognition at a time. Thank you for walking this emotional journey with us, for witnessing Rose's transformation and Simon's healing, for understanding that the most meaningful success is always measured in lives touched rather than dollars accumulated. We'll see you in our next story, where once again we'll discover that the most extraordinary changes often begin with the most ordinary encounters between people who are ready to see each other clearly. Until then, remember that your work has value, your dreams have merit, and your dignity is not dependent on anyone else's recognition. But how beautiful it is when that recognition comes, when it creates space for healing and growth and the possibility that tomorrow can be different from today.